I think the idea of the Long March, even if it's not strictly what turned out to happen, is a useful frame for what's going on. So what is the Long March? Well, it's an idea that crystallized in the late 1960s as a strategy for the overthrow of Western capitalism through cultural means. The idea was to gain control of institutions like perhaps higher education, universities, schools, churches, perhaps something like the BBC, silence your opponents, politicize those institutions, and then use that to shift public opinion and usher in a revolution. In its time, it was quite influential, particularly in the worlds of education. But it faded somewhat as the New Left lost energy and ran into some of its own contradictions. Today, some do look at our increasingly woke, for want of a better word, institutions and see the long-term triumph of that Long March. And it is true that some of its intellectual heritage underpins the new orthodoxy and its methods. But what's happened is the result, I think, of long-term trends, not an overnight shift. But I think it's clear on its face that something like the National Trust, whatever its issues, has not been invaded by a sleeper cell of radicals. So what is really going on? And I'd like to suggest three long-term forces that are at work. One of those is the rise of the Brahmin left. Highly educated elites are now left-wing. They vote left-wing. And that is a huge shift from 50 or 60 years ago. Thomas Piketty, who you may know from his book Capital, did some very interesting research on this. It's very clear in France, Britain, the United States. It's a global trend, and it's a massive difference. And of course, these are the people who run our institutions. We've seen how that plays out to some extent in Brexit as well. But just having more left-wing elites is part of what's going on. Another thing, less well appreciated, is the spread of managerialism. That's partly in our public services, a legacy of Blair. It's also something that Margaret Thatcher probably started in the university somewhat earlier. But the thing about managerial culture as opposed to distinct professional cultures is it's something of a monoculture. It's the same everywhere. So fads spread very, very fast across all these different institutions because you have the same managerial framework. So that's part of the reason something like Stonewall can go everywhere. And then finally, workplace law. And I will hear from Maya and some of the others about more contemporary legal issues. But there have been long-term trends in legal issues going all the way back to civil rights law, which, although one might not think it, is really where the bureaucracy of diversity begins to be invented. You have to have HR departments after the Civil Rights Act in America. And that's so it shows these very sort of long-term things start to have an impact. Does all of this matter? Well, I think not because it's the wrong side or the right side in charge of these institutions, but it matters because institutions exist to do very important jobs that matter to all of us, like education or policing. And politicizing them, adding new priorities, risks diverting them from their core mission or compromising it. And sometimes, if it's done for fashionable reasons, not even with obvious benefits to the new causes that are supposed to be more important. It is often forgotten that the Long March was a revolutionary doctrine. It was intended to co-opt and subvert institutions, not to improve them. And to the extent that what we see today is in that tradition, I think we should be concerned.